Start my time yet. I'm Jonathan Moreno from the University of Pennsylvania. I have a very important matter that we need to resolve today. I believe it is the thing we can resolve today. I'm a little OCD. The W in GP-write, is that capitalized or not? I'm going to say it's not capitalized based on extensive research I did. And I think we can actually get that particular controversy out of the way. But I need to get my slides up. So how do we do that? Somebody can do that for me. So I teach medical ethics and history of science. That's not me. That's too much. That's too smart for me.
Just go on to window.
Nobody showed me the secret. There's the secret. Okay, that's me, Moreno. Under you. Yeah. God bless the scientists. So really lovely to be here today. I'm really grateful to be part of this session. Not a scientist. I had a kind of an historical perspective I wanted to bring. We had this wonderful March for Science a couple of weeks ago, and I asked myself, since I teach history of science, could this have happened 50 years ago? I think it would have been unthinkable to have a March for Science in 1967 when I was in high school. What were people thinking about with regard to science 50 years ago? If you said science to an American, I think their association would be, well, the space program. So I did a little Google search. This is how I do most of my research. And what came up right away was this Soviet stamp from '67. They didn't get there before we did, by the way. What really surprised me even more was that the French had a stamp the same year. They didn't get there before we did either. But we were thinking about driverless cars, except that they were on some other kind of apparatus. Still thinking about that. And of course, Isaac Asimov. When I do a lot of neuroscience and robotics, we want to talk about the three laws and so forth. 10 years later, 1977, what was science in '77 according to Google? Where there was this. This is a somewhat confused period because there was also this. And so which direction are we going in? And then I just, again, for fun, I do this once in a while. Today, what we have, well, a couple of physics and engineering and a couple of biology projects are listed in this week in science. You can do this at home. What's happened in the last 50 years that we need to pay attention to in a project like this? So this is some work that was done in North Carolina a number of years ago. This shows that conservatives' trust in self-identified political conservatives' trust in science has plummeted. This only goes up to 2010. No doubt these lines have continued. So there's something going on here that a project like this needs to pay attention to. I'm not telling you anything you don't know. So this is I read with great interest the summary of the first meeting. I was not at the first meeting, and I was wondering if there was any ethics in the first meeting summary. Turns out there's a whole lot of ethics in the first meeting summary. I just identified this particular block here. There's a lot of scientific efforts that have gained public trust, but unfortunately there's a lot that haven't. I think this is a very complicated story, which if you take my class at Penn, we talk about. A lot of it is not about science. I think a lot of it is mistrust of scientists, which is a somewhat different problem. Which is why, by the way, it was really good to see all those people with one head and 2 arms and 2 legs marching a couple of weeks ago. I think a lot of people had never seen so many scientists in one place. So there's this notion of responsible innovation that was in the summary. I think this is good. There were these other terms and concepts which were really good, I think, in the science article. And more, thinking about a better future, accelerating research and so on. I think a lot of people can get behind this. I think these are consensus values that we have, and I think this is a good start. But I do have a couple of suggestions, and I think these are questions that were raised by some of the critics about a year and a half ago. But I think they are worth, for GP-write, small w, to consider, perhaps in the ELSI part of the project, perhaps in a public engagement part of the project. So how do we communicate to people what is a human genome? There's even disagreements among the scientists that I talk to about whether we have a human genome. The one that's published is not the human genome. Now, there are hundreds of gaps. There are from several individuals. I think Dr. Church just said, and we not published a single human genome without the gaps. So there's a reasonable question there, as far as I can tell. What would be the unique benefits of synthesizing a human genome? This is a question that's going to take years to think about, and I think lots of public engagement and transparency. And should the priority be given to less controversial genomes first? I think that's sort of, in effect, happening anyway. But I would say let's not rush it. The cell loans only principle, I think, is a good concept. I think it should be reaffirmed by an ELSI panel for GP-write. And then the question, does this policy apply only to human and other large genomes, as stated in the summary, or what genomes does this policy apply to? And I think there should, again, be no artificial deadlines for making these decisions about synthesizing the human genome. Let's do it, pardon the expression, naturally. Let's see what unfolds over the next few years, would be my advice. Bioterrorism is not something we talk a lot about in a project like this at the moment, but I think it is important, and I know that this is important because I read this guy's book, Regenesis, by Dr. Church, and that's where he said that. So I take that seriously. This takes us to some policy issues that will definitely put you to sleep. Not nearly as interesting as the octopus. Nonetheless, we do have to think about it going forward. Dual use research of concern is defined in these ways, and I will only say that DIRC, pretty unpleasant term, DIRC in the US tends to be top down. That is to say, the way that the DIRC policy has developed is based on certain select agents. You can read the select agent list online at that website. But I think that's not the way that a project like this can go. I think we ought to have a bottom-up approach, much like the ones that the Europeans do, in particular the Germans. I know this will freak out some of the scientists in the room who are very worried about undermining the progress of science, but I think we can do this in an efficient way. And in any case, we really don't have a choice. The public will demand that there be a very careful consideration each step of the way in a project like this. So I'd say the GP-write LC panel should specify a bottom-up DIRC review policy. I also think there needs to be a regulatory review. Maybe one of the first things that the project does is look at the whole landscape from GINA to the Biological and Toxin Weapons Convention to see what's missed with respect to downstream risks and how we might actually be able to make some positive contributions to the PTWC and other international bodies to fill in some of the blanks, because there are lots of blanks in this field, as there are, by the way, also in neuroscience at the moment with respect to these international arrangements. And finally, again, we need to think about new ways of doing public engagement. It's painful. It's annoying. It takes time away from the science. I know all this, but it is something that we just have to do. And we especially have to do it in the next year, because there's an anniversary coming up. And I can guarantee you that some clever and maybe not so clever journalists are going to say, gee, it's a funny thing, they're starting this GP-write thing. It's the 200th anniversary of the publication of Mary Shelley's Frankenstein. How about that? Isn't that a coincidence? So that's all I will say for the moment. I hope I cleared up the grammatical question, which may be my biggest contribution today. And I look forward to any comments or questions. Thanks.
Thanks so much. I'm curious, as a historian of science, is there precedent in history for cultural and social assent to any kind of technological project in some formal, a priori way, or?
Yeah, good question. And got a semester? So, you know, it takes a while for people to adjust to new ideas. And so, for example, next year we'll also celebrate the anniversary of the birth of the first test tube baby, baby Louise Brown in '78, who was called Frankenbaby on the front page of a New York City tabloid. So, you know, now, a few years ago, she had her own baby the old-fashioned way. Now there are probably over 1 million IVF babies. It takes a while for people to adjust. That doesn't mean that everything that the technology starts is a good thing to start. But it does mean that many things are, and the public isn't always wrong about its initial reaction. But it does often take a while for people to adjust and to gain trust in people like you. There are many other such examples. You know, Frankenstein pretty much freaked people out too. That was the era of the Romantic Science period, as it was called. And people really thought that you could, since electricity was only identified by the founder of my university, Benjamin Franklin, as a liquid only 20 years before that, the idea that you could electrify a dead body and bring it back to life, that got people's attention too.
So we don't have a semester, but I'd be very interested in hearing, in 25 words or less, your advice on public engagement specifics.
Right. Next question. Look, I think Barbara Evans is the person who's going to really deal with that. Fortunately, that's about 8 words, I think. Look, there are ways of doing this. There are lots of models out there. I think again, people being able to see the scientists themselves on social media, for example, talking about their work, it's a venue that we have now that we didn't have 10 years ago, even 5 years ago, that we should really take advantage of. So I would suggest I haven't really thought about this. You asked me. A social media component to this project would be a great thing. And I know some people who can help with that. Thank you.
Sorry, last question. Could I ask you why you think public engagement and public dialogue is a pain? Because this is a scientific community, and I would argue it's the responsibility of all scientists to be able to engage and explain what they do, given that we're all pretty much public funded. So I don't understand the language there.
I was doing too much role reversal with my colleagues who are scientists who really don't want to leave the laboratory and don't really want to talk in public too much. Pardon the facetious approach, but I do think it's very important, it's critical, and it is part of the role of the modern scientist. We're not Francis Bacon. It is something that does go with the territory. So thank you. Thanks.
My name is Barbara Evans. I'm from the University of Houston, and I was asked to speak about ethical, legal, and social implications of GP-write. And I have no conflicts to disclose. I want to disclose that sometimes I've used the acronym ELSI in a way that confused people. I gave a talk about this a year ago, and someone came up to me afterward and said, "Who is ELSI?" As if it were a person, or Elsie the cow. For those of you not from the United States, this is an iconic milk advertising image. And knowing the importance of IP rights in this space, I want to make my use of this image be within the fair use exception, so I need to give you scholarly commentary. I don't like her necklace. I think she would look better in pearls. This excellent 2014 article describes the ELSI program of the NIH, which is one of many similar programs in other innovator nations that have looked at ethical issues since the Human Genome Project began. I'm happy we'll be hearing from one of the co-authors, Nicole Lockhart, in the lunch session today. And I'm happy about that because I was not able to access that article yesterday. First, I hit a $96 paywall. And being a sophisticated user, I thought, well, I will go to the National Library of Medicine, where the NIH has done wonderful work making things open access. When I got there, I was told I was being blocked for possible abuse. I was abusing the NIH, apparently. But I was pleased that this said that the accusation was not meant to imply any maliciousness on my part. Bottom line, I never got to the article, and this gave me an idea for a proposed idea for GP rights ethics. Ethics should never be behind a paywall. Fortunately, I found this article on the NIH website about the article I was blocked from getting into, and it summarizes these key points. That the ELSI program served as the de facto conscience of genomic research, and that it anticipated ethical issues before they actually came up. I'm not sure these are the right concepts for GP rights ethics effort. I don't think we want to outsource our conscience to professional ethicists and lawyers. I think if we have responsible science and an engaged public, the people can be their own conscience, and that's what the goal should be. Also, this thing of anticipating problems before they arise seems really relevant if the problem is an asteroid that's heading to destroy the Earth, and it's going to take us 35 years to mount an interception effort. But with ethics, it doesn't take 35 years of investment to be ethical. You can just do it when the problems come up. And I think it's very important in a project like this one to have a sense of the ripe ripeness of the problems. That's R-I-P-E. It's a legal term. It's that you address problems when it's timely to address them. GP-write, as I understand it, is looking at basic foundational science to develop tools and technologies that will have many potential future uses. And I think it's not responsible to jump ahead to what might be done with that technology 100 years from now and debate whether we should do this step because someone might clone Albert Einstein 100 years from now. I also would urge the scientists to do their part on responsible communication. Quit telling us that this is going to cure cancer this year or next year. It's not. These are long-term benefits and long-term risks. What we need now is to have clear, transparent enunciation of what the goals and limits are of the effort, and then we can respond to the ethical issues that are timely at that point. Now, I have 3 modest proposals. I think we're in an age of citizen science, and that heralds a new citizen-driven bioethics. I'm coining the word PELSI for people-driven LC work, and I looked that up to make sure it wasn't obscene. It has another meaning as a fur coat, the dative case of that in ancient Icelandic, and there's a village in Estonia with that name, so I think it's okay to use it. Second principle is if science wants public trust, we need to start trusting the public. We can be transparent with them and assume that they have some wisdom and can make reasonable decisions about science. And then in addition to responsible science, we need responsible communication all around about what the risks and benefits are. We need more participation by the public, and I like this notion of 7 dimensions of participation. 20th century ethics focused on the 4th one, informed consent. Informed consent is not so relevant in basic scientific efforts where you're not asking people to participate. What people need is some feeling of access to decision making and goal setting, and control and ownership in the governance process of what gets done with things. And I think the ethical and legal scholars need to subject themselves to that. We need to ask the people what legal issues are of interest to them. I think IP issues are extremely important, but I don't think they're the legal issues foremost in the minds of people. People want to know, how is this going to affect my job? Is it going to be safe? Will the regulatory process be so cumbersome that we'll have to wait forever to get the benefits of this? I think we need to have people involved in setting the LC agenda in a way that hasn't been done before. I may be out of time. I'll just say that there was a recent study by the National Academy of Science that noted that this technology has the potential to produce so many diverse products that it's going to be a strain for regulators to cope with it. And I think one of the useful LC roles this project can play is to help the regulators with their horizon scanning of what may be coming, to help them get ready for it and develop regulatory science tools for risk analysis, and help develop a front door for innovators so that they know which of many regulators they need to go to facilitate that, so that the benefits can move to people more quickly. Thank you. I think I'm out of time. Is there time for questions, or should we?
So here, I have a question. I'm intrigued that you suggest that the people should make the ethical decisions. In the era of fake news, in a country where most people think the Earth's only a few thousand years old and there's widespread disbelief in evolution, do you think that the people rather than ethicists are best qualified to make these decisions?
Well, being American, I'm from a country that has a long history with putting restrictions on people's right to vote, and I don't believe there should be an educational test for a person's right to vote on an issue in which they have a stake. The people who don't understand science still should have a voice, and that puts the burden on the scientific community to do a better job educating them than perhaps we've done. If we view people as having a real voice, then I think it becomes much more real to communicate with them and be transparent and help bring them along so that we can get better decisions. I don't believe in disfranchising people because they're not sophisticated. Is there any other question?
Hi, I'm a grad student in human genetics, and I spend a lot of time with non-scientists. And when I tell them I study human genetics, they always say, "So you're making X-Men?" Because I guess I hang out with a lot of nerds that aren't scientists. But they also, everyone's minds immediately go to designer babies and all these scary things that I think people think that because we're saying we can build something, that we understand it so well that we could make the things that they're scared of. And I know, mainly because I'm so far along in a PhD in genetics, that we're not really close to what people are really afraid of at all. And I think that communicating what we don't know is extremely important. And maybe if we get people along for the ride now, when we do get to the stuff that they think is scary now, they can see the potential in it. But I guess communicating what you don't know isn't what scientists focus on all the time. You want to always say what you're good at and what you do know. And I was wondering if you thought like being relatable in terms of what we don't know would make people more scared or feel like we're more relatable.
Well, in the interest of time, I'll simply say I think you've made a very important point. I think transparency means telling people the limits of your knowledge as well as the prospects for knowledge. And I think being honest about these things, we just don't know because we haven't tried it, but it might comfort the public if they had a better sense of that.